That's awesome. Okay, so talk about what does it mean to be a Thomist? Because there's different aspects of it, right? His methodology, his actual theology, and the way he presents things. There's a lot of people who want. Everyone loves to be a Thomist. It's a very sexy thing to say I'm a Thomist.
Yeah.
But are they truly Thomists? How would you define things?
Yeah, there's definitely a very broad way in which people will speak of Thomism. And in a sense, and people have gotten mad at me before, like, in a sense, it could be as broad as saying that every Catholic, in a way, is a Thomist. Because St. Thomas has more authority than any other doctor of the Church. St. Thomas has been praised by very many popes with the highest praises. His doctrinal positions on issues that the Church have not decided yet are considered to be safe. And even in the canons of the Church historically, St. Thomas's doctrine and method are set forward as what ought to be taught to seminarians. So in a way, we can talk about every Catholic being a Thomist, because, and this kind of confuses people, because people get the wrong idea, and they're taking Thomist in a univocal sense and say, oh, well, you think that every Catholic should necessarily, or every theologian should be bound to necessarily affirm whatever St. Thomas affirms. It's not what I'm saying. It's not what I'm saying at all. Really what I'm saying is that the relation that, let's say, a Franciscan has to St. Thomas is different than the relation that a Dominican has to Blessed Scotus. Blessed Scotus, he's like, he can kind of interestingly take from Blessed Scotus and say, oh, well, that's cool, he's interesting. There's no real, Scotus isn't a real authority for a Dominican. But for a Franciscan, St. Thomas is still their common doctor. So if that makes sense for people, that's what that is indicating. So broadly speaking, we can say in the broadest possible sense, every Catholic is a Thomist, as long as by Thomist we mean somebody that has a degree of reverence for the teaching and general authority of St. Thomas. It would not lightly depart from one of his teachings.
Could they say, well, we have an advantage because we know where you're coming from, but you don't know where we're coming from?
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, like, I guess a Franciscan has to be trained to think like a Thomist to some extent, right? Just by being Catholic, right? Mm-hmm. But a Thomist doesn't necessarily have to be trained at all to think like a Scotus, right? Because it's not.
Yeah, it is very. Yeah, that's a good point, because the thing is
like, I have to live in your. They have to live in your world.
yeah, exactly. There is a degree. Yes. So I guess there's an unfair advantage in that way. But yeah, there's a degree of piety that is owed to the common doctor of the Church that is not owed, especially to the doctors of other schools. Because traditionally speaking, each one of the orders have their special doctors. For the Dominicans, it's St. Thomas. For the Augustinians, it is Aegidius Romanus and St. Thomas. For the Franciscans, well, for the Jesuits, it's actually St. Thomas. For the Franciscans, it is Alexander of Hales, St. Bonaventure, and Blessed Scotus. So each one of the orders have their special guys that they follow, but there is a degree of general reverence had for St. Thomas that is unique. So yeah, that's in the broadest possible sense. Now, we can kind of restrict that a bit too, because due to this general reverence that is owed for St. Thomas, and due to the fact that there are particular orders which take him on as their teacher, you can have, in a way, following Aegidius. For example, you're an Augustinian, you're following Aegidius Romanus. Mm-hmm. You can say, I am an Aegidian Thomist. I am a Thomist who follows particularly the teachings of Aegidius. Or, you're a Jesuit and you like Suarez. It's a very popular author to like as a Jesuit. I'm a Suarezian Thomist. I follow the teaching of St. Thomas as interpreted by Suarez. So those are all fine definitions. I mean, if you want to say, well, I am an eclectic Thomist, which basically says I have a general sort of degree of following to St. Thomas, but I don't follow him too closely. Like, I agree on the primaries, but kind of everything else, I'm coming up with my own positions on things. So there's broad ways in which you can speak about a Thomist. But in the most narrow technical sense, what it means to be a Thomist is to follow the teachings of St. Thomas as they are interpreted within the Dominican order. So the Dominican order has a long line of commentators and interpreters of St. Thomas who provide a general sphere of interpretive groundwork. So yes, there's differences between different types of commentators. They'll disagree on very particular issues of how to interpret St. Thomas, but there's a general sphere of interpretation within the Dominican order, especially, I want to say this was after the time of the battle between Durandus and Natalis, which would have been early to mid 14th century. So since this time, there has been a general reverence for following St. Thomas, and even slightly after his death. I mean, there were decrees within the Dominican order to follow the teaching of St. Thomas as completely unique, and there was a early time of battle where there was a guy named Durandus who wanted to fight against that authority, and another guy named Natalis just destroyed him and made him rewrite his commentary on the sentences, which are massive, 3 different times. So after this point, it was pretty indisputed within the Dominican order. But yeah, generally, broadly speaking, that's what it means to be a Thomist in the strictest sense, is to follow the teachings of St. Thomas Aquinas insofar as they are interpreted within the Dominican order.
And that would include basically those 3 big works of St. Thomas, the commentaries and the sentences, the Summa Theologiae and the Summa Contra Gentiles. Who were those commentators that you said were the ones for each?
Oh, yes. So there are basically there's the 3 monarchs of Thomism, if you want to put them like that. So in the 15th century, there was a man named Jean Capriolus. He was a French Thomist. I think he died in like the 1450s, although I'd have to look more into that. He wrote the first big defense of St. Thomas Aquinas. This is kind of he provides the general interpretation of St. Thomas that is basically taken on most issues throughout the history of the Dominican school. So he wrote a commentary on the sentences, or really basically a commentary on the sentences, but he just kind of ransacked the rest of the works of St. Thomas to get all the other quotations, and then answered particular objections given by other medieval scholastics against St. Thomas. And then you have in the late 15th, early to mid 16th century, he worked for a long time, but Thomas de Vio Cajetan, or just Cajetanus, a lot of people refer to him as. He was Italian, northern Italian. He was actually cardinal, and he's the guy at Worms who faced off against Luther. Interestingly enough, so he has a history of a lot of interesting things. But he wrote a famous commentary on the Summa. He wrote some commentaries on works of Aristotle's, Ad Mentem Thome, which basically just means according to the mind of Thomas. He wrote Bible commentaries, which kind of were a little bit shady. Near the end of his life, he got a little bit shady on some issues from his interactions with the Protestants. And he wrote various different polemical works against Protestantism. And then for the third one, it's Sylvester Ferrara. So Sylvester Ferrara, he was also so Cajetan was cardinal, and he was the head of the Dominican order. Ferrara was the head of the Dominican order after Cajetan, I think, so same time frame. And he wrote a commentary on the Summa Contra Gentiles. So these 3 works basically formed the nucleus of everything else that's going to be said in the tradition when it comes to Thomism. They basically, any major position can probably be traced back to those 3. And then 2 other major figures, if you kind of want to round it out, is in the Baroque period, which was after the Council of Trent, starting 1570s, 1580s, and going for about a century. You have a group of commentators on the Summa who fought a lot and wrote a lot. This was a time of Suarez, who I mentioned earlier. They fought a lot, they wrote a lot, they got things very, very precise, very fine detail, very long works. This was the time in which we were fighting, the Molinists and the Thomists were fighting. This was the time of Louis de Molina and the Congregation de Auxiliis. This was all of that fighting time that we had. But there was a theologian who kind of crowns, I guess you could say, the jewel of Thomism during this time would be John of St. Thomas. I actually just did a biographical video if anybody's interested. But John of St. Thomas, He's known as the second Thomas because while he was not like a foundational figure like the last three I mentioned, he certainly was the most faithful and erudite exponent of St. Thomas, and he that's ever been. And I mean, he wrote a 3-volume Cursus Philosophicus going over all of the issues of philosophy, and then a 10-volume Cursus Theologicus. He only finished the first 8, but the last 9 and 10 were compiled from his notes by his student. But yeah, John of St. Thomas, very faithful, erudite. And then the next generation, we kind of get a little bit less development going on within the scholastic, within the schools. But what is advantageous of this is that you have a lot of the bounds being drawn. We had so much just like bloating and expansion of just people just writing crazy amounts of just pages and pages and pages of stuff. And then you kind of had this period where it's like everybody, weirdly enough, agreed to stop doing a bunch of development and let's just take a breather and kind of just like draw the battle lines again, which is basically what occurred. So these were some of the great systematic figures within Thomism. Bill of Art is probably the best example of this in that era. Bill of Art, he was a French Thomist. I'm actually translating one of his works, which are very good. It's called the Summa Summae, which is a 3-volume sort of systematic treatment of Baroque scholastic theology. It's one of my favorites for sure. But yeah, that and I think that would probably be about it. After this point, you have a little bit more decay. You have basically Thomists are kind of just repeating what has been said and then fighting various different heretical groups like the Jansenists or rationalism or whatever. And the next period comes like the Thomistic revival in the Leonine era. That would be like 1880s to 1950s. And this is a bunch of people kind of reaching back and trying to grasp the go back to the Baroque period and grasp the magic that made so many just brilliant, smartest people ever to exist happen to be within the same city in Salamanca, Spain, fighting each other at the same time over Christian theology, which is just it's a blessing because we're just standing on the shoulders of absolute giants who were all sharpening each other at the same point.
So should an aspiring Thomist start with St. Thomas and then those 3 monarchs, the commentaries, or should they start with someone who's something more modern that's synthesizing all that together in a easier format? I don't know. Is Garrigou-Lagrange, is he lockstep with them or 90% lockstep?
Yeah. The Garrigou-Lagrange, he was an excellent, wonderful gift that God gave to the church. He wrote a lot of work on systematic theology, everything from fundamental theology to Mariology to Christology to doctrine of God. He wrote on mystical theology. He just has so many great, excellent, fantastic works. But, and there's going to be a but here, but he does tend to overly, and I'm trying to be pious here to a great father in the faith, but he does have a tendency to over-restrict the Thomistic tradition. And this caused some blind spots, I would say, with how he interacted with other figures within the Thomistic school of his time, most famously Father Francisco Marin Sola. So I guess I would absolutely, everything Garrigou writes is 99% wonderful, excellent, beautiful, and I love it. A good place to start is his work Reality, Thomistic Synthesis. I think that's a very good intro work for a lot of people. For aspiring Thomists, I mean, your first step is to learn Latin. I mean, that's always your first step, because once you learn Latin, it just opens up a lot more. If you already know Latin, read the Summa Summae by Bill of Art, or there's another figure named Gonet, his Manuale Thomistarum. That's a very good work to read. These are like syntheses written by these first-class Thomists, and it's really excellent that they wrote these syntheses. Edouard Hugon, his Theologia Dogmatici, I think it's Tractati Theologia Dogmatici. Yeah, if you just look up Edouard Hugon, it'll come up. His because we refer to everything in Thomism to their cursus. It just means like their course, or their like group of books, basically. So like, oh, they're cursus, and they usually all name it Cursus Theologicus. So when you have those names that are that are not Cursus Theologicus, you have to think for a second. But yeah, Eduard Hugon, he has a 3-volume Cursus that is that's very good. But again, it comes down to whether you know Latin or not. So learn Latin, and in the meantime, reading the works of St. Thomas are always fruitful, are absolutely always fruitful. I would not suggest, because I know that I would get asked about this, but I would not suggest reading these. So this right here is a 3-volume translation of Thomas de Vio Cajetan's commentary on the Summa. It's excellent that we have it in English. It's just a very to retain my piety to a man who's much brighter than I, but it's not that good of a translation. In many places, it's misleading. So yeah, it's better to just read something more mundane than to read something that's badly translated. At least in my opinion, because it can cause some bad habits, especially if you're just starting out. You don't want to get into the wrong terminology or way of thinking or anything like that. But yeah, if you're an aspiring Thomist, your first step is learning Latin. Sorry, that's just the if you don't want to learn Latin, then you can pick up, I don't know, bread making or sewing or something. I don't know. Pick up something else. don't pick up the one thing in the world where 99% of its literature happens to be in Latin still.